Hello, I'm Sharryn Kasmir, and I want to thank the Biennale for inviting me and Mamolona also for organizing this. I'm an anthropologist, and I've studied cooperatives in the United States and also in the Basque region of Spain, and I've studied workers in a GM factory in the southern United States. And so my perspective on cooperatives comes from a larger perspectives on workers in general and working class activism in general. So I want to situate a discussion of the cooperatives in that context. My talk today is about the Mondragón cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain, and many people may have heard about them. They're the largest and considered to be the most successful system of industrial cooperatives and financial and consumer cooperatives in the world. There are 74,000 workers in the Mondragón cooperatives and 257 firms. And if I get my number right, I think 100 joint ventures or subsidiaries in 60 countries. It's important to say that the Mondragón cooperatives don't emerge from a recuperation or from a political struggle in the ways that the recuperated factories that we're talking about today do. And I think that really marks them in important ways. And I think we heard two talks now about the need for militant activism and a relationship between the community and the co-op workers. And that really is a dynamic feature of cooperatives that come out of a recuperation process or a political process. These cooperatives that I'm going to talk about are much more bureaucratic and they're much more centralized. And I want to talk about what that looks like and what some of the lessons we can learn about the disidealization process and the isolation process that can happen in workers' cooperatives when these other processes take over. Okay, so my work on the cooperatives in Mondragón began in the late 1980s, early 90s, when the Mondragón cooperatives at that point were being used as a model to talk about ways in which people in industrial areas that were experiencing deindustrialization in Europe and in the United States could find a way to keep their factories in place. So the goals were much more modest. It wasn't about workers' control, and it wasn't about production for use or egalitarian social relations so much as a pragmatic solution to a problem of deindustrialization. Of course, there was more ideological aim in some sectors, but for the most part, it was a pragmatic solution, so it has a different context. And I wrote about Mondragón and did research on Mondragón about the actual social relations that I found on the ground, which I found to be very different from the kind of model that was being presented as this premier model for how we should all aspire to organize workers' cooperatives. And I began to return back to the Mondragón research I did earlier in these last years as the interest in cooperatives was growing and as there was more and more discussion about alternative economic forms. So my purpose today is to contribute an example of a large economically successful cooperative with a bureaucratic institutional structure that operates plainly in a global capitalist market and global capitalist labor market. Okay. In my comments, we're going to see that the cooperatives come squarely up against this problem that we often hear phrased as cooperatives are islands of socialism in a capitalist sea. So I want to look specifically at issues of labor and politics, and I want to ask, are there cases or what are the circumstances in which cooperatives can fragment and divide working classes rather than unite them or lead them forward? And these issues came into stark relief in 2013 in Mondragón, where when the flagship brand of the Mondragón cooperatives, Fagor Electrodomésticos, which is a home appliance division and flagship brand of the group, declared bankruptcy. And the group is comprised of industrial factories, financial services, a bank, a social security cooperative, and a large-scale retail cooperative that has something on the order of 2,000 retail establishments throughout Europe, 90 of which are supercenters, very akin to something like a Walmart in the United States. When the Fagor Electrodomésticos, which is the home appliance division, declared bankruptcy, 5,600 jobs were lost. And this situation was such that 1,900 of the jobs were for members, 200 of the jobs were for temporary workers. Let me get my numbers right. And 3,500 jobs were for wage laborers in subsidiaries. And the subsidiaries were in low-wage countries and in Asia, Northern Africa, the post-Soviet republics. And the conditions for each of those three categories of workers were very different after the bankruptcy. The members, because of their privilege as members, held on to their jobs by moving to other cooperative factories that are affiliated into the system, or by taking early retirement, or by retraining. The temporary workers were simply fired, and the workers in subsidiaries were also let go. So this exposed issues of divisions along global labor scales that were of concern. And it went contrary to the kind of way that the model is talked about. So let me talk a little bit about how that way the model is talked about. The cooperatives are not unionized. Workers instead are represented internally by social councils. And firm-wide decisions are taken in the General Assembly, which elects a governing council, that in turn appoints a CEO and a management council, and there are parallel bodies at the group level. Mondragón limits its manager salaries to 9 times that of the lowest paid worker, and if you compare that to the CEO to worker ratio in Spain, which is 127 to 1, or 331 to 1 in the United States, that seems like a narrow margin. And the reinvestment of surplus is substantial, directly into the cooperative bank, but also through members' cooperative accounts, which are held as private accounts, but the money is made available to the group as a whole for investment. It also it guarantees employment to its workers through these transfers, but also through voting down reductions in salaries during crisis times or increase in capital investments during crisis times. And to advocates of the Mondragón model, these seem like testament to the fact that the Mondragón cooperatives are solidaric institutions and that they prize labor over capital. Ooh. But Mondragón undertook international expansion in the 1990s, and at the same time it shifted power from the individual cooperatives to the group as a whole. That's when you get this, oh, sorry. Okay, that's when you get this 3-tier, is that better? Yeah, sorry. That's when you get this 3-tier division of the temporary workers, wage laborers, and the members. So when the cooperatives declared bankruptcy, when the Fagor cooperatives declared bankruptcy, members took to the street to defend their jobs, but workers from the factories in the town that were not cooperatives came out to support those workers. The workers in the non-cooperative firms knew that the fate of the cooperatives was also part of the fate of the town. Fagor had 18 factories in 9 countries and 11,000 workers worldwide before the crisis. Only 5,600 remained at the time of the crisis. But they still currently control 100 foreign subsidiaries and joint ventures with approximately 12,000 workers for their other member co-ops. These firms are not worker-owned, and their employees do not have rights or privileges of co-op members. One place where there are a lot of these subsidiaries is the Kunshan Industrial Park near Shanghai. And in that industrial park, workers, as you can imagine, are they're producing auto parts, and they are working at very low wages for very long hours in very harsh conditions. And there's every reason to believe that it's not just in China that these kinds of conditions are existent, but in Mondragón-owned subsidiaries. For example, in Poland, there was a strike over condition and wages in 2008. So Mondragón cooperatives operate like standard firms. They're a kind of collective capitalist that returns to cooperative workers and creates from the cooperative workers a kind of aristocracy of labor on a global labor field. But those relationships happened at home quite a bit earlier. As early as the 1970s, there was talk in the labor movement in Mondragón about the cooperatives creating an aristocracy of labor in the factory that was isolated from the rest of the working class and that weakened the regional working class, right? So it didn't just have ramifications for the cooperatives themselves, but a depoliticizing ramifications for the working class in the region as a whole. So it's not just globalization that creates these problems, or the globalization of labor, but there's something intrinsic to the cooperative process as you see the actual labor relations on the ground that creates divisions politically between a cooperative working class sector and everybody else. It happens through use of temporary workers or wage laborers in the factories, but it also happens through a kind of slow politicizing process whereby the cooperatives withdraw from their alliances with the rest of the working class via unions or participation in assemblies or in participation in demonstrations. And over time, this creates a kind of isolated part of the working class that creates divisions locally, and then we see them again reproduced globally. Because of course the cooperative workers voted in their general assemblies to open these subsidiary firms, employ temporary workers, and employ workers in subsidiary factories. Okay, so just to close here, cooperatives are a tricky kind of form, and I think we hear people saying this. On the one hand, they can create social welfare for their members. They can create opportunities for self-management, but on the other hand, if we think about this in terms of a wider category of labor, they can create divisions and islands of privilege that not only can minimize their own impact in their own workplaces, that's something I didn't talk about, but I can in the comments, but also can minimize the way in which a local, regional working class can really assert itself and form itself. So I want to put on the table the idea that we need to look very closely at cooperatives and the social relations that actually exist as we talk about models, because sometimes the processes are different than you think they might otherwise be.